And welcome back. The secret sauce behind a managed FortiSwitch is having a FortiGate that's managing that switch. So in this video, what we're going to do is let's put a game plan together for setting up the firewall, including FortiLink, in preparation for onboarding a new switch. So for our game plan, let's use Firewall 1. In fact, you know what? Firewall 1, I've done so many configurations on it over the last several weeks. Let's go and do a factory reset on Firewall 1, and that way we'll know exactly our starting point with all the defaults in place. In fact, let's go ahead and kick off that process right now, and that way it can reboot in the background. So here's Firewall 1. Let's just do a quick get system interface. And currently, on its logical internal interface, it has the IP address of 192.168.1.71. That's currently where I'm connected. So let's go ahead and do a factory reset. We'll do an execute factory reset. And on this platform, it's going to go ahead and come back up with the IP address of .99. And we'll just do a quick initial config, and then we'll have a good starting point regarding this firewall. So this firewall is a model 60F, and on that 60F it has ports A and B, which by default it's going to be using as part of its logical FortiLink interface. So let me go ahead and label FortiLink. And if we don't want to use ports A and B, we can go ahead and use other ports, but since they're already there, let's go ahead and use those. And let's connect those over to switch 1. So switch 1, its model is a 108E. And regarding which ports to connect to, we want to make sure we're connecting to ports that are already enabled for auto discovery with FortiLink. So there's a few ways of discovering what those ports are that are enabled for auto discovery with FortiLink. One is we can get the documentation out. That's not a bad idea. Go to the online doc and verify, which ports are set up by default for auto discovery. Or if we're at the CLI, we could just go ahead and look at the configuration. So currently this switch, which is switch number 1, it's at the management IP address of .121 on my Office management network of 192.168.1. So we could just SSH there once again and take a look. So here on the switch, if we do a config, switch, interface, and let's just see what we currently have. Yeah, right here, port 7, and 8, and 9, and 10. Fantastic. So these ports, by default, are automatically set up for auto discovery. So as far as plugging in, we can just plug into port 7, 8, 9, or 10. However, as I look at this, ports 9 and 10, they are SFPs. They've got little SFP modules. So if I have SFPs in both of those that support copper, I'd be great. However, I don't. And so I have a couple that support fiber, but on my firewall, it only has copper at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and let's plug into port 7. We'll go A to 7 from the firewall to the switch, and then we'll go port B on the firewall to port 8. So that'll be our game plan. So on the switch, this will be port 7, and this will be port 8. Also here at the FortiGate, we also want to make sure that we're enabling the switch controller function on the firewall. And that way it has the ability to manage the switches over the FortiLink interface. And let's also discuss some of the protocols that are going to be in use between Firewall 1 and Switch 1. One of those protocols is actually called the FortiLink protocol, and that's used for the discovery process. However, another protocol that can also be used for discovery is Link Layer Discovery Protocol. So if that's enabled on both the firewall and the switch, it could also be used. However, the FortiLink protocol is the default method for that discovery. Another protocol between the switch stack and the firewall is CAPWAP. Now, CAPWAP is an acronym which stands for Control and Provisioning of Wireless Access Points. And if you notice, these are not wireless. However, they're using that protocol for the switch as it sends logging messages up to the firewall. Other protocols are going to be in use between the firewall and the switch or switches would include DHCP. So the switch can dynamically learn an IP address from the firewall via its DHCP services enabled on the FortiLink interfaces. And as part of DHCP, the switches can learn about their DNS servers that they should use, their default gateway, which would be the firewall that they should use. They're also going to learn about NTP, Network Time Protocol servers. And as there's interaction between the firewall and the switches, other protocols that will be used are HTTPS and SSH. So at the FortiGate, if we want to open up a command line over to a switch, we can simply launch it from here, and behind the scenes, it's using SSH between the firewall and the switch that we want to CLI to. So now that we've done a factory reset on the firewall and we've given it a few minutes to initialize, its default IP address is going to be 99 on my 192.168.1 network. And so let's go ahead and configure it. We'll set it back over to .71, which is where I want it to be. And by default, the firewall is going to have one virtual domain. And if the firewall was in multi-VDOM mode, we could set up this FortiLink from any of our VDOMs, but they do need to be in NAT mode. So by default, we're going to have our one VDOM. It's by default in NAT mode, so that's already set up. And then as far as the IP addressing and the DHCP services that we're going to enable on this FortiLink interface, let's go ahead and choose the subnetwork of 10.7.0.0 with a 24-bit mask. And let's use .71 everywhere on the firewall, including its FortiLink interface. So with that in mind, let's do the initial bootstrap here of Firewall 1. All right, so I've opened up a browser and it's forcing me to set a new password, which I'll do. I'll confirm the password and click on OK. Now it's asking me to log in. I'll put in the new password and click on Login. All right, it wants me to do a little bit of follow-up work here. I need to specify the host name and set up my dashboard. So I'll click on Begin, and we'll call this FW-1 for Firewall 1. Click on OK, and then we'll just use the optimal dashboard setup. Click on OK, and I'll say we don't need to see the video in the future. Click here on OK. So let's set up its IP address to .71. So to do that, we'll go ahead and collapse the dashboard. We'll go to Network, go to Interfaces, and here on the logical internal interface with these 5 physical interfaces associated with it, let's go ahead and modify its address from .99, the default on this platform, over to .71. So we'll go ahead and double click on the internal interface, and I'll specify right here that we want to use .71. Also, I'm going to turn off DHCP services. This is my office network. I don't need this guy handing out IP addresses there. So I'll disable DHCP on this management interface, and I'll also enable HTTP. So when somebody does connect or tries to connect to HTTP, it'll just redirect over to HTTPS, which is great. And we'll click on OK. And it's warning me saying, whoa, you're on this interface. You're connected logically on this interface. Are you sure you want to continue? I'm going to click on OK, and then I'll have to go ahead and reconnect to the correct address. So let me go ahead and put in the right address here of .71, press enter, and advanced. It's using a self-signed certificate, and log in. All right, so we're in. Now it's complaining that it can't reach any FortiGuard servers, and that is because I don't have routing in place. Let's fix that. Let's go back up to network. In fact, let's take a look at our routing table real quick. Go to dashboard and network, and we'll click on routing. It knows about one network, 192.168.1. That's its directly connected network. However, it doesn't have a default route. So let's collapse the dashboard. We'll go over to network, and we'll go down to static routes, and let's add a static default route by clicking on create new. And we'll specify that the outbound interface is our logical internal interface, and the default gateway we want to use is 192.168.1.1. That's the default gateway here in my home office, and we'll click on OK. All right, now to verify that that's actually working, we could just open up a command prompt real quick here and do an execute ping out to www.fortinet.com. If that works, that means a lot of things are working, including DNS and also reachability out to the internet. Fantastic. So we'll close that. And now that we have a nice base starting point for this firewall, let's go back and take a look at interfaces. And right here, we have this interface called FortiLink. So let's edit this interface. We can do that by either double-clicking on it here, or we could highlight it and click on edit. Either way is great. So here's what this says. We've got this interface called FortiLink, F-O-R-T-I-L-I-N-K. It is an aggregate interface, and what that means in English is that we can do link aggregation. We can have 2 physical interfaces that make one logical connection to the other device. And at the moment, we have these 2 interfaces, A and B, that are associated with this logical FortiLink interface. If we scroll down to address, it says addressing mode dedicated to FortiSwitch. Perfect. That's what we're going to use it for, except I don't want to use the 10.255.1 subnet because our plan was use 10.7. So let's go ahead and say 10.7.0. And let's use 71 for the last octet here with a 24-bit mask. And currently there's no FortiSwitches connected. That's true. There's nothing connected. And here's the option for automatically authorizing devices or not. So if we enable this and new FortiSwitches show up, they'll automatically be authorized. However, initially, I want to go through the process and walk you through what it looks like to see them show up and then manually do the authorization. And then we have this option for FortiLink split interface. It's on by default, but let's take a moment and have a chat about what that actually means, the FortiLink split interface. So to do that, let me bring back this diagram and let's add on another switch. So we'll go ahead and bring on switch 2, and let's also add on switch 3. So I'm going to put some connections between those switches, and let's talk about that option for the FortiLink split interface. Currently, we don't need that option enabled, and here's why. Currently, we have the connections, the FortiLink connections, for the members of the FortiLink interface between Firewall 1 and a single switch. So we're using both port 7 and 8. So we could disable the FortiLink split interface, and what would happen, it would effectively make a logical pipe out of both those interfaces and then internally do load balancing between the firewall and the switch. So it's fantastic. So if each of these are a gigabit, we'd have a throughput of 2 gigs between Firewall 1 and Switch 1. And that's because both interfaces are enabled, and they're both enabled as part of link aggregation. Fantastic. However, if we were going to change that, and let me remove one of these links, let's imagine instead of the existing configuration that we do this, that we connect port A on the firewall, which is a member of the FortiLink interface, down to switch 3. And port B, which is also a member of that same FortiLink interface, we connect it to switch 1. So now we have 2 different ports as part of the FortiLink interface, but they're going to different switches. And that's when this feature right here, the FortiLink split interface, is very, very useful. If we enable this feature on the FortiLink interface, the firewall is only going to use one of those 2 interfaces, not both. So for example, maybe it picks A and it goes ahead and disables or shuts down port B. So it still has a connection to the stack and can still work with the stack, but it's not going to use both interfaces at the same time. So if there's a problem in the future with interface A as a member of the FortiLink interface, it can then go ahead and bring up B. So if you enable the FortiLink split interface, it's only going to use one of its interfaces as part of the FortiLink active at any time. Now, another question to ask is it possible to disable the FortiLink split interface and still have the same physical configuration? And the answer to that question is yes. And here's the scenario. If we enable multi-channel link aggregation, which means we have one logical link aggregation here, and it goes to 2 different switches, if switch 1 and switch 3 are both configured to support multi-chassis link aggregation, then we can have these physical connections. We can disable the split interface option on the FortiLink, and it's a way of having our cake and eating it too. However, we need to make sure that we have all the configurations in place on switch 1 and switch 3 for multi-channel link aggregation before we disable that feature. So a lot of times when we're setting it up, we'll enable the split interface for FortiLink, and then after we've configured our switches to support multi-channel link aggregation, then we can go back and turn it off. So for now, let me go ahead and clean this up a little bit. For now, because we just have the one switch, we can use both those connections, and it will simply be a link aggregation group that's being used by the FortiLink interface. So having said that, let's jump back on the firewall and continue looking at its FortiLink interface. So back to the network section we go, and if we click here on interfaces, here once again we have our FortiLink. Let's go back in. So for our purposes, we don't need to enable the FortiLink split interface. We'll go ahead and disable that. And next we have our DHCP server settings. Now these are the DHCP server settings for the switches who will become effectively DHCP clients. And also, I didn't click on apply earlier, so I need to go ahead and specify the correct IP address again, which is 10.7.0.71 with a 24-bit mask. And then our DHCP range, let's go ahead and make it 101 all the way through the rest of the range. And so our switches, as they come online and get IP addresses over the FortiLink interface, they will be getting DHCP addresses from this DHCP service on this firewall's FortiLink interface. So there's the range, there's the mask, the default gateway will be the IP address here of .71. I'll leave the defaults for the DNS server. And what's kind of interesting regarding DNS for these Forti switches is that not only are they going to be given IP addresses, but the actual FortiGate is going to create A records, IPv4 A records, regarding the IP addresses and the names that those switches have. So we'll take a look at that as we proceed as well. So I'll leave this specify as a default here. And for the least time, I'm going to cut that down to like maybe 500 seconds. And that'll cause the switches to renew their IP addresses a little more often than the default. And if we scroll down, I think that's all we need here. And this time we'll click on OK. So let's see what we have. We have a FortiLink logical interface. It has 2 members, ports A and B, and my little 60F. And if we scroll to the right, here we have our DHCP range for the 10.0 subnet of 101 through 254. And for administrative access on this FortiLink interface, it's allowing ping and a security fabric connection. So now with our current configuration on the firewall, with its FortiLink interface set up with ports A and B, our next step is to take this switch, switch 1, and physically connect port 7 on the local switch to port A, and port 8 on this physical switch to port B on the firewall. And then the auto discover should happen by itself. At least that's the hope, and we'll get to verify that in detail in the next video. So I'll see you in the next video in just a moment when we connect this switch up to the FortiLink interface. Until then, I hope this has been informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.